purple sheet. The white sheet is also out there. If you didn't bring yours from last week, he's going to finish up on the last of the of last week's handout. The last of last week's handout. And then we have the purple handout that he will be starting on today. So glad to have you all. I am, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Melton and let him begin. Give him as much time as we can.
It's so good to be with you. I taught this morning in a college class, and you all are very different than they are. They are in a lot of ways. The main one is that they want you to start late and finish early so they get out. So you all are not that way, so it's a breath of fresh air. I have a colleague who teaches at Erskine with me, or I teach with him, and he said, he made a statement one day that education is the only commodity that we purchase, that we are happy when we don't get what we pay for. And he's talking about students that love for classes to be canceled or classes to be early or whatever. You're not that way, so that's a breath of fresh air. What we're going to do tonight, we said what we would do last night would be that, our last time would be that we would look at the major things that happened, the major events. And we've gotten right up to those, but we haven't really talked about them yet. So we're going to start out talking about that tonight, because that's critical for understanding the period that we're in. And then we're going to spend the rest of our time looking at the types of literature. The intertestamental period was a tremendous period of literary production. Huge amounts of literature came out. Much of it didn't survive, but even that which has survived is massive in content. Far greater than our Old and New Testament put together, if you could put it all together. So we're going to talk about some of the kinds of literature, and I'm going to give you some samples of at least some of the works that are in the Apocrypha. And then we won't finish that tonight. We'll finish that next week. And then next week we're going to try to put it all together and just pose the question and try to answer it. And that is, what is the value of doing what we've done over the last 3 or 4 weeks? What is the value in studying? This is a period of time that centers in Jewish people, Jewish events, Jewish literature. So what value is there for us who are on the other side of the incarnation and who are Christians? I think there's a lot of value for it. And so we're going to sort of summarize those things, and I'll have a handout for session 4 for you as well. You can add it to the others. But it's so good. And this morning when I left home early because I had some work to do before I taught my class and other things as well. And did something that I've never done before that I can think of. I left in a hurry, and I usually take my old pants and pull out all the pockets and put them inside. The stuff that's in the pockets, throat lozenges and some change and a couple of dollar bills. I left not only all that behind, I even left my belt. So one of my prayers is all day today. I'm getting thinner down there, but one of my prayers is, Lord, please don't let my pants drop off. So if you see me pulling, that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing. I'm thankful that He's answered that prayer so far. Okay, let's go back to what we were talking about last week, because the issue in the intertestamental period is this conflict between two groups of Jews, the Hasidim and the Hellenizers. Now that came about as the result of Alexander's making Greek the universal language. That was all the way back in the 300s. And the Greek language was adopted. It was overwhelming how quickly the Greek language took over. Alexander was not primarily interested in the practical benefit of everybody speaking the same language in commerce, because the people who lived in that part of the world during that time, most of them would have been bilingual, trilingual, even multilingual. They would have spoken their ancestral language, they would have spoken many different languages. So the primary purpose of it was not practical. It's part of the brilliance of Alexander. He realized that with the spread of a language would be a spread of a culture, and that culture is Hellenism. It's the Greek way of thinking. He realized when people began to speak the Greek language, you'll begin to be influenced by Greek values, by the things that the Greeks thought were important. And in many ways, the Greeks were a very noble people. But that was the conflict of the intertestamental period. And so what happens when Hellenism, this Greek, multiple belief in multiple gods, the celebration of the beauty of the human body, the tolerance that was so characteristic of Greeks. One of the other characteristics, which of course was, I should have mentioned, but I didn't, but one of the other characteristics of Hellenism, which is not surprising to us, is the Greeks believed that there were no moral absolutes. There were no commandments that were always true. There were no values that were always true. They were very much relativistic in their ethics. So while they would say that, we should not kill people, there are times that we can. Or we should not do this or should not do that, there are times that we can. The Greeks had no concept of anything even remotely akin to the Ten Commandments. And of course you can see that the Hellenism is alive and well in the world and in our society, because there are people, we don't call it that, but it's the same sort of thing. And so there were no moral absolutes. And so this begins to filter down. It begins to rush over that part of the world. And Jews see themselves as they're deeply divided over this issue. The Hasidim were those who believed that they were to remain faithful to their Jewish beliefs and practices. God had given not only the Ten Commandments, but the other commandments to govern their lives. And though there were lesser commandments and greater commandments, they made a distinction between that in their literature. Those commandments were to be obeyed simply because God uttered them. End of discussion, as far as I'm concerned. And that's the Hasidim. The Hellenizers, and they were varying degrees of Hellenizers. There were some who were sort of mildly conformed to the Greek way of life. There were others who had swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. We talked about last week the gymnasium, and we'll mention that again, but there's a story in 1 Maccabees, which is one of the books of the Apocrypha, that describes the Jews who were going to the gymnasium and participating, and that really was if you wanted to look at the Greek worldview and the Greek life in one picture, the gymnasium was their perfect. Whereas the synagogue or the temple would represent Judaism, the gymnasium did for Greek. All of these values that the Greeks stood for, all of these principles, they were all present in the gymnasium. So 1 Maccabees tells us about Jewish athletes going into the gymnasium. And one of them is criticized because he changed his name from a Jewish name to Jason. Jason is a Greek name. I think his name was Joshua, and he changed it to Jason because he wanted to fit in with his buddies. He didn't want that old Jewish name, Joshua, which of course in the New Testament translates into the name Jesus, God saves. And so he didn't want to do it. And then some of them, of course, they were exercising, without any clothes on. And some of the Greek boys became so self-conscious of their circumcision, which of course was the mark of being a Jew, that they would actually they actually went through a procedure to reverse the marks of circumcision. And don't ask me to explain that, because I don't know. Seems like to me when it's off, but that's a different story. But think about wanting to conform so badly that you would change your name and that you would go through something like that. So this Hellenism was like a bulldozer. For some of them, it changed everything about them, and so this is the conflict in the intertestamental period. And the issue was this, and we don't know anything about numbers, but from what I read, at least from the works that we're going to be talking about a little later tonight, the Jewish people were pretty much evenly divided. There were about as many Hasidim as there were Hellenizers. And the question would be, which one of these groups would win control of Judaism? That's what the issue is in the Intertestamental period. Now, remember that when Alexander died, he left no heirs behind. His kingdom was divided among his generals. I think there were 5 of them. The only 2 that we're really concerned about was Ptolemy, who got the southern part. He got Egypt. And Seleucus, who got the northern part. So the descendants, the kings who will follow Ptolemy, will simply be called the Ptolemies, and the kings who follow the Seleucus will be the Seleucids. Now, if you read about this in First Maccabees, the writer will often use the term Syrians for the Seleucids. It's the same group of people, they're just called a different name. So when whoever wrote First Maccabees, when he talks about the Syrians, he's really talking about the Seleucids. So the Ptolemies were here, and the Seleucids were up here, and Palestine is in the middle. And we talked about its geography, how difficult it has been for anybody in the ancient Near East to hang on to it very long. They can seize it, but they can't hang on to it very long, because if you think about it, with the Egyptians down here, and when they control Palestine, Palestine is going to be an appendix. It's on the edge of their empire. Long way away from its capital. So the further it's away from it, the more difficult it is to hang on to it. When the Seleucids controlled it, same problem. Their empire was centered up here. Palestine is an appendix. And so it's difficult to maintain and control. And then, if that's not bad enough, when you've got the country warring between 2 groups of people about equal numbers, and the Hasidim want to control Palestine, and the Hellenizers want to control Palestine, you've got a mess on your hands. And that's exactly what we see in the intertestamental period. So what happened was, just to review what we talked about, Alexander died in about 323. The Ptolemies controlled Palestine until about the 1100. This was a relatively peaceful time. And the reason is because the Ptolemies left the Jewish people alone. They weren't interested in forcing Hellenism upon them. And so this was a time of peace. The Jewish people living in Palestine, now there were Hellenizers among them, but it was not the day that the Hellenizers were in control, so they sort of kept quiet. And so life was centered around the temple in Jerusalem. It was centered around the local synagogues. There was only one temple, but there were hundreds, probably thousands of synagogues all over the place. Most of them didn't have buildings. They would meet under a tree. They were very much like house churches were for the Christians when they go out into the world. And so this was a peaceful time and a happy time, because the Ptolemies, as long as the Jewish people, kept whatever laws they had to, and they would be very few, as long as they didn't revolt and I guess paid their taxes, then the Ptolemies were satisfied. But all that changed in about the year 200. And all during this time, of course, the Ptolemies are down here. They're trying to keep Palestine up here are the Seleucids, and they're trying to get it from the Ptolemies. It's going to be hard for either one of them to do either thing. It's hard to keep it, and it's hard to get it because you're stretched out so far. Your lines of supply and communication are stretched out so far. But what happens in about the year 200 is that the Ptolemies fall into a period of weakness. They're not as strong as they were before. The Seleucids come in and they take control of Palestine. Now, the people who are favored by these foreign rulers changes. The Ptolemies basically allowed the Hasidim to do what they wanted to do, and the Hasidim controlled everything. So Palestine was under control of these very godly, conservative, law-abiding Jews. They worshipped and they did all the things that the law of Moses told them to do, and so for a period of time it was peaceful. But now the Seleucids come in and they will side with the Hellenizers. And if you pardon the expression based on that, all hell begins to break loose, literally. And I don't use that word lightly at all, because the Seleucids come in and they are not content to leave the people alone. The Seleucids come in and they have, their desire is to make all the Jewish people adopt Greek ways. Now they did that through a series of rulers, and let's see where I have to go back here. They did that through a series of rulers. We're not going to look at all of them, but there were a series of Seleucid rulers that went by the name of Antiochus. There was Antiochus the Great, and then there was Antiochus the First and Antiochus the Second and so forth. That obviously was not their real name, but it was a title. And the common ground that all of the Antiochus leaders had was they intended to break the will of the Hasidim. And they end up killing a lot of Hasidim. They end up attacking Jerusalem, because they are just determined that these Hasidim are not going to rule the nation. Now, the one that we want to think about most is Antiochus Epiphanes. His name was Antiochus, that was his title, but Epiphanes was something that he added to it. Any significance, and he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes. What's an epiphany? It's an appearance of a god. It's an appearance of a god. He had a rather elevated view of himself. He was a god. That's how he saw himself. And of course, he expected people to treat him like a god. Antiochus Epiphanes came to power in 175, and he would lose power in 164. And this is one of the big events that caused another big event that we'll talk about. Antiochus was probably the most cruel of all of the rulers in the Antiochus line. I mean, they were all, none of them were, people that you would want to live beside. And none of them, were Sunday school class material. They were, because the Seleucids were just that way. They were a violent, bloodthirsty people, and human life didn't mean too much to them at all. But he was the worst. Most people who read about what's said about Antiochus, and needless to say, what we have in the apocryphal book of First Maccabees is not objective in any way whatsoever, because the writer of First Maccabees believes that Antiochus Epiphanes is the devil incarnate. And I suspect if we knew him, we'd probably agree with the same thing. So didn't give us a whole lot of facts. But he, more than the others, was determined he was going to break the will of the Hasidim. Hellenism was going to win out. And he was going to break the will of the Hasidim no matter what he had to do. So the first way that he tries to break the spirit of the Hasidim has to do with the high priesthood. Now, keep in mind that when all of this is going on, Egypt had fallen into a period of weakness. The Seleucids had been able to take Palestine, and that, of course, is now being ruled by this line of Antiochus people. Egypt is not satisfied with that deal, so they have rebuilt their army. They've sort of risen a little bit in power. So while Antiochus is determined that he's going to break the will of the Hasidim, and that is going to rule the nation, he's also got to worry about the Ptolemies in the south, because they are moving up. And so he's got two big headaches he's got to deal with. Just keep that in mind. Antiochus Epiphanes, there is and remember what the high priesthood was. It was the holiest office in the Old Testament. It was hereditary. You had to be born into the high priestly line. And even if you were born in the high priestly line, if you were born with a deformity, or if you were blind in one eye, you were immediately disqualified. So only the best and the most righteous of the Jewish men could serve as high priest. The high priest was the holiest man of Israel. He alone had the privilege of going on the Day of Atonement, which is still celebrated by Jews today. It's a solemn feast. And it's usually in the fall, probably not, maybe even this season right now, usually late September or October. But remember that the high priest had the task of going into that most sacred place in the middle of the temple, the Holy of Holies. And he would offer up a yearly sacrifice, a blood sacrifice for Israel's sins. He had to offer up one for himself first before he could even do it. But this was a sacred, holy office. And it had been that way through most of the Old Testament period. The legitimate high priest was a man by the name of Onias. Onias was a godly high priest, but he was finding it very, very difficult to deal with Antiochus Epiphanes. And keep in mind, Antiochus Epiphanes is fighting war in Egypt. Not a big war, but the Egyptians are coming. And so Onias, or Antiochus Epiphanes, is approached by another man whose name is Tobias. Now, they weren't brothers. Tobias was actually in the high priestly line, but he wasn't chosen to be the high priest. But he had the credentials to do it, even though he was not a godly man like Onias was. But on paper, he could have been the high priest. He comes to Antiochus Epiphanes and says, I'll pay you some money if you make me the high priest. The high priest, this holy office, which goes back to, a particular segment of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's supposed to be the holiest man in all of Judaism in the Old Testament, and now this guy is making an offer, rather substantial offer. We don't know how much it was, but it wasn't pocket change. Well, here's Antiochus. He don't care who's going to be the high priest. He has no appreciation for it. He was having trouble with Onias. Onias was calling his hand on some of the things that Antiochus Epiphanes was doing. And so he wanted to get rid of him anyway, so Tobias comes in and gives him a big load of money, and he sends Onias off into exile. And now the high priest is Tobias. And Antiochus Epiphanes has gotten a huge amount of money to finance his war, his battles with the Ptolemies. Well, what goes around comes around. Another guy visits Antiochus Epiphanes, and his name is Jason. Now note, this is a Greek name. Not a Jewish name. He was one of those Jews who changed his name because he wanted to fit in with his Greek buddies. So Jason comes, and Jason is not even in the high priestly line. He has no qualification whatsoever. But he comes to Antiochus and he says, Antiochus, Tobias offered you X number of dollars. I can up that. Well, Antiochus is a pretty good deal. He's sold it out twice. And so he expels Tobias, and now Jason is high priest. So for the first time in Jewish history, the high priesthood is up for sale. It's the holiest office in the Old Testament. The high priest was to be the holiest man in Israel, and here it is up for sale. Neither of these are qualified, morally, spiritually, or genetically. They're not qualified. And of course, Antiochus Epiphanes has not only made some money to finance his continuing battles with Egypt and the south, but he's also sort of rubbed it in the face of the Jewish people again. He's determined he's going to break their will. Well, when this happens, riots break out in Jerusalem. The Jewish people began to revolt openly. They will stone Antiochus' soldiers who were everywhere. And so there are battles breaking up. And of course, these poor Jewish people had nothing to fight with except God, who was on their side. And so it's a bloodbath. Antiochus had absolutely no use for the Jewish people, and he had no reluctance whatsoever to order his soldiers to simply at will kill them by groups, pull out their swords and start killing people. The streets of Jerusalem were literally stained with Jewish blood. And yet, the Hasidim still remain faithful to God. Don't give in. Well, Antiochus, of course, as the conflict gets worse, and more and more Jews are being slain in the city of Jerusalem. And it wasn't just in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the hotbed of it, the center of it. But there were battles between the Jewish people and these Seleucid soldiers everywhere in the country. Now, you would think that anybody with any common sense would say, wait a minute, I got to back off of this because we'll have a bloodbath here in Palestine. We're going to kill everybody off. Because the Jews were killing them too. Certainly not as many. You would think that's what a person with common sense would think. But Antiochus, he's Epiphanes. He's God. And I don't know if you've ever had to deal with a person with a God complex, but there is no more difficult person on the face of this earth. The best thing to do is either get away from him or just shoot him. Because you're not going to get anywhere with him. And there are egos in ministry that are just about that big sometimes. Well, Antiochus does not let up. He orders his men to ravage the city of Jerusalem. He himself goes into the temple, this corrupt, murderous pagan. He goes into the temple and he goes into the Holy of Holies, this sacred space, the most sacred spot on earth to the Jew. It was in the center of the temple. The only person who could enter it, he was separated from the rest of the temple by this thick veil, this thick curtain. And the only person who could enter that was the high priest, the legitimate high priest, and only he could enter it once a year on the Day of Atonement, and he could enter it only after he had offered up an animal sacrifice for his own sins first. Antiochus goes into it and sacrifices a pig on the altar. Now, he knew what he was doing, folks. Nothing on the face of the earth would have offended Jewish people anymore than for this idolatrous, pagan, cruel, heartless, with no compassion for anybody except himself, who goes into the city and sacrifices a pig on the most sacred altar on the face of the earth. Jerusalem breaks out in war. But he's not done yet. Antiochus, in about 166 or thereabouts, he outlaws Judaism. He sends his men out into the streets, and if they see Jews that are reading the Torah, the law, they grab them and put them in a pile and burn them in the streets of Jerusalem. He forbids Jews to gather on the Sabbath day. He forbids Jews to pray in public. He even forbids Jews to circumcise their little boys on the 8th day. I mean, this guy is going to break their back if he can. And he thought he could. And so, for a little while, Judaism, the Palestine, which of course is where most of the Jews were, Palestine, is totally under the control of Hellenism. Antiochus is going to try to, nothing would suit him better than to eliminate every Jew from the face of the earth. Of course, we've had some later Antiochus type people that want to do the same thing, and there are people today in the world, as you well know. The outlaws, this was the biggest outrage. The Jewish people in the Old Testament period up until this time had never endured something. They had never faced this kind of hostility and rejection and opposition. And so what do the Jews in Jerusalem do? Well, the ones that can head to the mountains. They head to the mountains. There's safety there. Antiochus's soldiers could do okay on the roads and in cities like Jerusalem, but remember that Jerusalem itself is located on a mountain, Mount Zion. And if you look at the topography of the area, it is surrounded by wilderness. Well, these people that escaped knew the hills and the valleys and the hiding places. They knew where they were because they grew up there. Antiochus's soldiers were all mercenaries. They fought for money. And they weren't from around Judea, they were from, up here. Yes, sir?
Sounds like he was a Hitler of that time.
He was. It's exactly how he would be viewed. That's exactly how he'd be viewed. He is pictured in some of the works of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha that we'll at least get into a little bit tonight. It's clear that the writer is talking about Antiochus, and he talks about him in terms of the devil incarnate. There are all kinds of images, but they are clearly the same kinds of things that people said and wrote about Adolf Hitler. He is a type of Adolf Hitler. He just didn't have the technology to do the damage and the murderous things that Hitler did. And one wonders who will be the next one to rise up in human history. I mean, they're all over the world today in other places. So he outlaws the practice of Judaism, and the Jewish people, some of them, are stuck in Jerusalem, and they just have to do whatever they can. A lot of them die. The apocryphal accounts say that the streets of Jerusalem were literally stained with blood, Jewish blood. Some of it was the blood of Antiochus' soldiers because the Jews fought back. I mean, but the Jews were not an army. They were not a militant people. They weren't accustomed to taking people's lives. That's against the very law that they treasured. And so there was no match for them. But it looks like now, for many people, many Jews living in Jerusalem, they would say, our only hope is that God send the Messiah and rescue us. Now, one of the types of literature that's among those works that we'll get into, start tonight and finish up next week, is a form of literature called apocalyptic literature, and it's a literature that focuses entirely upon the end of the world. It is not accidental that that's one of the dominant forms of literature coming from this period of time. Because think about it, this was an unspeakable evil. This was an evil that had no parallels in Jewish history. I mean, there were some bad kings in the Old Testament that, Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian king, and he destroyed Jerusalem in 587. But he didn't do stuff like this. He didn't sacrifice a pig on the altar. He did better than that. He did desecrate the temple and went in, set it on fire, and took the sacred vessels that were used, gold and silver, and took them back to Babylon. But, if we go back and look at that battle, he was forced to do it by the response of the Jewish people. But he wasn't the same kind of tyrant that Antiochus Epiphanes was. And so it's perfectly understandable why so many of those works that were written were works that had to do with the coming end of the world. Because the Jewish people had never seen anything like this, and they believe there's no other world that God will hold back the judgment upon the nations of the world through his Messiah. Okay, so Antiochus is fully in control. The Hellenists, they're his buddies. The Hellenistic Jews, they've won. A lot of the Hasidim have been killed, but most of them have just gone into hiding. Now, in particular, there is a group of brothers. And they are called the Maccabees. There are actually 5 brothers. The only 3 that really entered into the story was Judas Maccabee, and there was Jonathan, and then there was Simon. 2 of them actually were killed in the battles that they were engaged in. These Maccabean brothers left Jerusalem when all this was going on, and they went northeast of Jerusalem to this tiny village called Modin. And there they saw a priest. Well, he was actually their father, I'm sorry. And his name was Mattathias. He was just a local priest. And he was there in Modin. We assume he'd been there most of his life, and that's where the Maccabean brothers had come from, and they had retreated there now that this was going on in Jerusalem. Modin wasn't, I don't know how many miles it was from Jerusalem, but it wasn't very far, and it's in the wilderness. Well, Mattathias is pressured by one of the Hellenizers, one of the Jews that wants Judaism to adopt Hellenism. They pressure him to sacrifice to one of the Greek gods. Now this was a Jew, but he was a Hellenizer. He was a pro-Greek Jew. And here's Mattathias, and he's a traditional priest. He's been doing the things that Jewish priests have been doing for all these years, and this guy presses him to offer a sacrifice to one of the Greek gods and goddesses, and Mattathias loses his temper. He pulls out a knife and he kills him. And of course the word spread to other Hellenized, Jews that favored Hellenism and so forth. His 5 sons take to the woods, and they decide, we're going to fight Antiochus' army. We've got an advantage that they don't have. We know the lay of the land. And we are fighting a holy war. Now, you know, God's people need to be careful about invoking the concept of holy war. We've done it at times in human history. You know, crusades and sometimes that's been used to cover the worst kind of human cruelty and bloodshed that's ever been done. But these Maccabean brothers believed that God was going to rescue Israel, and He was using them. They were fighting for the glory of God. Now they used tactics that make a professional army nervous. They used guerrilla tactics. You know, the Vietnam War. They used guerrilla warfare. Now, I, every time I talk about this, I think about one of the questions I would ask New Testament students would be, what was the method that the Maccabees used to fight Antiochus' army? And inevitably somebody would say, well, they used guerrilla warfare. And I always say, well, if they had guerrillas, they would use them. But there's a difference between guerrilla and guerrilla. Guerrilla warfare is when you catch your enemy by surprise. You catch him at night when he's sleeping. You catch him when he's down. And so Judas Maccabeus and his brothers were joined by and they were freedom fighters. That's the best way to describe them. They were guerrillas. They were holy. They lived by the Torah. And they were freedom fighters. And so they began to attack small groups of Antiochus' soldiers, because he sent his soldiers out to find the rebels that had escaped from Jerusalem. And so these Seleucid soldiers, or Antiochus' soldiers, they didn't know the lay of the land. This is foreign to them. And so they would use guerrilla tactics. They would know where the hiding places were. They would catch the army off guard. They would catch them by surprise. They would attack and kill these small groups of soldiers, and then they would take their spoils. They would take their food. They would take they would take whatever they had, their animals or whatever they had, and then they would move on and do another. Well, what happened is when Jewish people realized that this was happening, more of them went out and joined these groups of guerrilla forces, fighting for the glory and the holiness of God. Well, a remarkable thing happened, folks. In 3 years, actually about 2.5 years, but in 164 BC, the Maccabees and their army had won. They had taken Jerusalem from Antiochus and his people. They gained control of the land. And of course, they interpreted this in no less way than a miracle from God. Humanly speaking, it was a miracle. I mean, that would be like a high school team playing the Dallas Cowboys, which probably wouldn't be a big hard thing to do. But, I mean, it's impossible that they could
It's
win.
like the Patriots defeating the British Army.
Oh, yeah. But it was nothing short of a miracle. Now, humanly speaking, we have to look at it in terms of historically. One of the things that Antiochus was dealing with was not only Egypt here in the south, but there's another empire on the move. Rome is coming from up here. And it won't be long until Palestine will be a part of the Roman Empire. And so Antiochus not only has battles that he has to fight against the Ptolemies in Egypt, but he's got to send some of his army up here to stop the advancing Roman army. And so, practically speaking, that's an issue that it had to be. But as far as the Jewish people was concerned, they didn't care anything about that. This was a victory of God Himself. It was nothing short of a miracle. God had answered their prayers, and so they take control of Jerusalem, Judas and his brothers, because Judas won't last too much longer. He'll be the first king when this takeover takes place, and then he'll die. And then his two brothers, Jonathan and Simon, will actually be kings and high priests in one office, and they'll be controlling the people, in Palestine, the Jews in Palestine. But the Hasidim have won, because Judas and his brothers, they were pure Hasidim. Now, what's interesting, however, there were some Hasidim that had some problems with Judas and his brothers. And here's one of them. When the Maccabees were fighting the Antiochus' soldiers out here in the wilderness, of course they're good Jews, so on the Sabbath day they would fight. Well, it didn't take long, and I don't think Antiochus' soldiers were all that smart, but it didn't take long for them to figure out, that would be a good day to attack them. And they started doing it. And some of the Maccabees would stand there and not defend themselves and let the Seleucid soldiers kill them. Well, Judas, now he's not a priest, but Judas, he's their leader. He says, wait a minute, this won't do. So on his own, he goes back and reinterprets Sabbath law. He says that if you are defending the honor of God, it's okay to fight on the Sabbath day. And therefore he justified fighting on the Sabbath day, because obviously the Seleucids could take advantage of that. Well, that didn't bother most of the Hasidim, but there were some of the Hasidim that really didn't say, well, that's a compromise. That's not obeying the Sabbath law like they believe they should, and so that's going to become an issue a little later. But the Maccabees, the Hasidim, are fully in control, and they celebrate it with this joyous feast called Hanukkah. I can't spell it right. I think that's right. Because they cleaned the temple up, cleaned it of all the pagan stuff that had taken place. Of course, a pig had been sacrificed, and in December of 164 BC, they reopened the temple and rededicated it to God. It was free of all the pagan things that had been put in it from Antiochus's bunch, and it's one of the most joyous feasts in Judaism. It takes place in December. It makes abundant use of lights, it's candles, they have meals that are associated with it. Now we need to be careful, because I remember one day in class someone said, well, the Jews just tried to hone in on Christmas. And I said, well, first of all, Christmas is not a possibility for a Jew in a sense, because, it centers in the coming of the Messiah. But your chronology is a little bit off. Hanukkah was being celebrated for 164 years before Jesus was even born. But this is a beautiful, joyous feast. Many Christians will attend Hanukkah celebrations. In most places, they are welcoming and wide open for non-Jews to be a part of it. But it's a joyous celebration, and that's what they're celebrating. They're celebrating an impossible victory and a re-cleansing of the temple. The temple is now again clean. It's a place where God can dwell. It is presided over by a priest and so forth. And so the Maccabean revolt is one of the favorite memories for Jewish people. It lasted about 3 years, and it really was. It was an example of something impossible that happened. The Antiochus Epiphanes and his crew, his army, they were defeated by these people that were just people out in the woods, country boys. And they believed they were fighting for God's honor and glory and for God's truth, and they won in a period of that period of time. Now, what happens after that? We don't go into kind of detail. What happens for the next 100 years is The Hasidim ruled, they're in control of the Jewish people for about 30 years. And then the Hellenizers get back in. And so there is a seesaw battle for most of that 100 years, where a Hasidim leader will come in and he will become the king. He'll rule for a while, and then he'll be ousted. And these guys were not voted out; most of them were carried out. It was a violent time to be a leader of the Jewish people because you probably were not going to retire, no matter which side you were on. And so it's sort of a seesaw battle. Which way will the Jewish people go? They'll be Hasidim for a while, and then the Hellenizers will get control and their leaders will be in, and then they'll go back to the Hasidim and so forth until finally the only queen that they had was a lady named Salome Alexandra. She was actually a queen of Jews and was probably one of the best leaders that they had. She was better than most of their kings. But she ruled, and she was getting ready to go off the throne, and she had two sons. One was sided with the Hasidim, and the other son was sided with the Hellenizers. When she died, her preference was that the son who was favorable to the Hasidim would be the next king, this queen, and that's who she grew for the job. But when she died, her other son also had his support, and the Jewish people are in a civil war for 4 years. Hasidim are fighting Hellenizers. The streets of Jerusalem are now stained with Jewish blood, but it's not coming from an outside army. It's Jew killing Jew. It's a desperate situation that they've never been in before. A delegation of Jewish leaders from both the Hellenizers and the Hasidim get together, and they make a long trip to Rome, who is the next kid on the block. The Roman Empire is steadily moving east. When Antiochus Epiphanes had to worry about him, that's one of the reasons he had problem winning the Maccabean revolt. But anyway, they go to meet with the Roman leadership, and they beg Rome to come in and put down the civil war, because Jews were killing Jews. Initially, Rome says no. Look how far it is. This is a worthless piece of land. There are no natural resources on it. There's no money there. Most of Palestine, you can't get any money out of it. But eventually, Rome decided to come, and they invade Palestine in the year 63. The general who led that invasion was Pompey. The city would be named after him. It takes them about 2 years to stop all the fighting. In 61, Palestine is given the name of Judea, and it becomes a part of the Roman Empire. Now, our story needs to stop at that point, but the Jews, when we begin reading the New Testament, they are under the control of now the Romans. And life will, in many ways, will be a continuation of being in control of Antiochus Epiphanes, but the Romans have another kind of slavery that they can put on people. And so that's, for all practical purposes, the intertestamental period comes to an end. The Roman period begins. All right, I've gone way too long and too far, and we have just a few minutes. I'm not going to try to introduce you to the literature. You can look over the outline, and we're going to define and talk about each of those forms of literature next week. But are there questions? I know we all need to go to eat, but are there questions you want to raise? If you want to just come up here individually, you can do that. Are there questions that you want to raise about
Do you have any idea what the average lifespan was in the Greek society?
among the Jews, it was 45 for a male, and a little bit more for a female. I don't know in terms of Greeks. I don't know enough about that. I would think it would probably be, you know, if they played if they were, you know, become involved in the gladiator games, that they probably, you know, it's probably going to be shorter than that. But I suspect it was about the same. But it was 45. If you were 45 in the days of Jesus and you were a male, you needed to make funeral plans. You weren't going to be around too much longer. But there are exceptions to that.
Yeah.
John the Apostle is said to have lived to be 100 years, or close to 100 years old, because he seems to have been alive at the end of the first century. And, you know, there's a woman that Luke tells us about, I forget, it's not Elizabeth, maybe Anna, at the birth of Jesus, she's 80 years old. So there's some old people. But, I mean, it was not a place where you get old very often. All right, thank you all very much. And I'm